This is The Behavioral Divide, brought to you by Avantis Investors, where we bring together both academic research and real-world financial advice to uncover insights that may help us make better financial decisions. I am Jeremy Thornton with Avantis Investors, here with our host, Professor Hal Hershfield. And Hal, I absolutely loved this episode. The topic this month is around, how we change or how we can help others change in positive ways in their lives. And I don't know if it's just that I'm in this midlife crisis era of my life. I don't know if it's a crisis, but it's certainly in the midlife part. I've got getting some of the gray in the beard now, and I'm always thinking about, what are things that I should be doing to change, to be healthier, to be a better dad, be a better husband. These are just things that I think are going on in my mind right now. And so I just absolutely loved this topic. Why don't you tell us some of the things you thought about it and who joined us this week?
Yeah, no, it was, what a fascinating conversation. We were really lucky because on the advisor side, we had Tiffany Rosetti. She's a financial advisor and senior vice president at Wealth Enhancement. She also really interestingly holds the behavioral financial advisor designation. So she really understands a lot of the behavioral side as well as a nice intersection. And on the academic side, we almost had the perfect person for this. We did have the perfect person for this, Katy Milkman. She's the James G. Dinan Professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a prolific academic. She's the co-founder of the Behavior Change for Good initiative. She's the host of Choiceology, and she's the author of the best-selling book, How to Change. And so, we really focused on this topic of, like you said, how do we help ourselves and how do we help our clients change? I think, to me, one of the big insights that stood out was this sort of disconnect where we oftentimes think that the painful stick is the way to motivate change, but really it's the carrot. And how do we actually, I'll say it this way, create better carrots and more motivating ones? And that was, one of the big topics that we unpacked, especially as how it applies to procrastination. What about you?
I think some of the examples you're going to hear about the carrots and the sticks and how advisors can use those working with clients, I think that's really going to resonate with people and be really, really quite interesting. I don't want to give all those away because there are some really, really good things that both Tiffany and Katy brought up. So I think let's just let folks hear it for themselves.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, let's go to the episode.
I'm really excited to talk about this today. From my perspective, to some extent, we're talking about a pretty central topic to advising. I mean, sometimes advising is all about keeping clients on track. Maybe you've already set goals. Maybe clients are already sort of doing the behaviors that are allowing them to reach those things, and things are humming along smoothly. But other times, and maybe a lot of the times, it's about helping clients or maybe even helping ourselves navigate some sort of change, decide to do things differently, actually go through and follow through with doing something differently. And what I want to be exploring today is what are the actual best ways to do so? And like Jeremy said, we couldn't be joined by two better guests in Katy and Tiffany to be doing that. So Tiffany, I want to start with you. And I want to sort of level set. And I would love for you to tell me about some of the times or some of the good examples that you can come up with when you've tried to get clients to change some sort of behavior. Just on the example side, we'll get into how you actually did it and what you did, and we'll get into that later. But I'd love to just kind of level set and say what are those situations? And by the way, it could also be about changing behavior for yourself or for your colleagues. But I'll let you sort of take it from there.
I think one of the most common that I've come across is going through retirement, right? We're changing a behavior, going from working to this new life of starting to pay yourself. And I have a story around this, if that's okay. I have a client that I started working with. It was early in the relationship, and he had this goal in his head that once he hit $4 million, he was going to retire, right? Time came, not long after we started working together, he hit his $4 million, and then he moved the goalpost, right? All of a sudden, 4 million became 5 million. And so we had to kind of level set and take it a step back and say, okay, this was your goal. This is time to retire. What's your roadblock? Why did you move the goalpost? Right. And so we had to bring that into a much deeper conversation that, stemmed from his values, his money messages of how he grew up, And that really played a part in him being afraid to retire, right?
Yeah.
The other piece of it, it was abstract. He didn't know what retirement looked like. So we had to help him kind of visualize that and verbalize to us what retirement looks like, and giving him the way and the space to be able to explore that.
No, I think that's super interesting. And especially this concept of like setting something up in advance, which is what we should be doing, but maybe it's too abstract and then we change the goalposts. Katy, I'm curious if that resonates with you, that sort of idea that I'm like gonna make a change, but then I sort of change the change. And if that sort of maps onto some of the other contexts that you've seen, especially in the work that you've done and the work that you've done with others along the way.
Yeah, I think change is scary to a lot of people, and we often move the goalpost or procrastinate. Why do today what I could put off until tomorrow? That's a really common feature of decision making. In fact, so common that it's a whole chapter of the book I wrote on how to change is about that very barrier of procrastinating and how do we deal with it. So I resonate very much with the challenge you just raised, Tiffany. I think it's a great one, and one that a lot of people will find familiar, whether it's about, moving the goalpost on retirement, or even say, next year I'm going to start saving at a higher rate, but not this year. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things we procrastinate on. And then there's a lot of wonderful science I know we're going to talk about on what we can do about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I can also imagine, of course, retirement. I love that you brought that up, because that's, first off, something I'm really interested in. It's the type of thing I study. It's a topic that I have spent a lot of my time on. But it's a canonical type of change. And there's so many other ones, right? Like I could imagine it's also like getting my clients to start thinking about a 529, thinking about an estate plan, or changing, Katy mentioned saving at a higher rate, or maybe cutting back on spending and so on. I mean, Tiffany, I'm curious, when do you typically bring up or broach the topic of change, and how do you do it? When you do it?
I like to have the conversations when things are stable, right? When my client is at a good place, rather than when it's at the point of change or when they're forced to make a change. Because then I can get a sense of how they make decisions, how they process information, so that it's not as stressful of a change. It's not as stressful of a transition. It's better to have that while they're at a level place, not emotional, they're able to make their decisions from a better grounded place.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, it's funny because I think sometimes we aim to do that sort of thing. Like we aim to say, like, let's talk about a change when things are calm. And then things are calm and you're like, well, I don't want to rock the boat. Now that things are fine, let's not actually rock the boat. I mean, do you ever, maybe it's easier because it's like, this is your job. You're talking to clients. It's an easy thing to bring up. But do you ever have that sort of issue too, where it's like, our client says, well, why are you talking about an issue now? Things are fine.
I have learned, since I've been in this industry now for 18 years, early in my industry, I like to keep things comfortable myself, right? Mm-hmm. Why rock the boat if I don't have to? But what I realized over the course of working with clients is that they tend to be calmer when times get rough, when we've already had the conversation. Mm-hmm. They already were prepared. You already prepared me. I knew this time was going to come. I'm better prepared. I feel more centered. I know what our plan is. Rather than being kind of off kilter, calling in a panic, not being able to make a good decision because they're not coming from a centered place.
Okay, that makes sense. And probably some of my questions are pointing out my very non-confrontational nature. But I mean, Katy, I'm curious, is there a right time to put change into place? I know you've obviously done some great work on this topic, and I'm teeing this up for you a little bit, but I'm curious how you'll respond to this. Is there a right time to put change into place?
I actually think the right time is now, if you feel ready, always, right? Never put it off if you can, if you have the motivation in this moment to get something done. But a big problem that a lot of folks face when they're thinking about change is the procrastination problem that Tiffany described in her first example. And when we face that, we need to figure out, okay, how are we going to find a way to actually make sure there's a moment when this thing launches, when this change actually happens, and then we're not constantly saying, oh no, tomorrow, oh no, tomorrow. And in my work, what I've found is there are moments that feel more appropriate for change, and this is actually work with your wonderful colleague, Hal Hershfield at UCLA, We have studied moments that feel more opportune for change. We call them fresh starts. And these are moments that feel like new beginnings in our lives. So the most famous and the one we can all relate to is New Year's, right? That feels like a chapter break in our life story, right? Oh, last year that was the old me, and this year it's the new me. And the new me is going to be different and better. And the old me, yeah, okay, I didn't get my finances in order, but that person's in the rearview mirror. It turns out, though, that set of feelings, that optimism, that sense of turning the chapter to a new page or creating a new chapter and a new beginning, that arises at other moments too. So the start of every new week is a miniature fresh start. Mondays, we should see much more goal setting happening naturally on Mondays than on, Saturdays, Fridays, and so on. It's actually like a nice linear decline in goal setting across the week. We see it at the start of new months, following birthdays, after breaks from work or school, and holidays that we associate with fresh starts. So think more Memorial Day and Labor Day and less Valentine's Day. But there are holidays that in our cultures demarcate the passage of time and sort of say to us, this is the beginning of a new era. We've also seen some big effects when we remind people it's the first day of spring. So thinking about if now doesn't feel right to you or to your client, now being first best, I never want to say like, oh yeah, just put it off until a fresh start. Now is always the best time to take action and make a change. But if now isn't clicking and someone's insisting on procrastinating, you definitely do want to lock in a plan. I loved that piece of advice. And we call that pre-commitment in our nerd language in academia, right? Like, say not just I'm going to do it sometime in the vague and distant future, but let's lock in a specific time, because then it's going to be harder to keep procrastinating. And a specific time that seems to be very attractive in the research we've done is a fresh start date. In fact, we even have a study where we were trying to get people who were not saving for retirement to start saving, and we randomly assigned them to either be invited to begin saving after a fresh start date, so say after the start of spring or New Year's or after their birthday. And then we had a control group that was invited to actually start saving at exactly the same point in the future, but we just didn't label it. So if Hal had a birthday in 2 months, we'd flip a coin and we'd either invite him to start saving in 2 months or after his birthday. And it's literally the same offer, but when we label it as after his birthday, people notice, oh, that's a fresh start moment. What an opportune time to take this action. And we see about it depends on sort of which statistical model you use, but like 20 to 30% increase in savings over the 8 months after we make the ask among the people who got that fresh start labeling assigned. So this can be very useful in thinking about how do you frame that conversation with a client who's not ready to start now. Think about whether there's a fresh start date that might be meaningful to them, where you could get them to pre-commit and peg their plans to make this change to that fresh start moment.
I love this. I mean, you know that I love this work. And Tiffany, just before I go to you, I want to just ask one other question about this, because Katy, you mentioned labeling it. You're saying labeling it as like after your birthday, but from a very practical standpoint, from an advisor perspective, would it work even if I said, here's a fresh start, or is that too much on the nose? Does it work better to sort of like more subtly say like, what a good time to do this next step would be like after your birthday, after you guys get back from your trip, Labor Day, whatever it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't explicitly tested like teaching people the science of fresh starts and then saying, and here's one. But I would think it would work that way just fine. I can't see why that would break down, because you're sort of explaining to them like these are moments when people are more open to change, and let's find one that works for you. What we have tried and doesn't work, and where I thought you were going as you started to ask that, is to just sort of like invent one out of the clear blue sky. Like we've played with, oh, it's the 100th day of the year. Doesn't that feel like the perfect fresh start for you? No, it doesn't. People find that ridiculous. And so you can't just make a day a fresh start. There does seem to need to be some sense of meaning to them. And in surveys we've done, the more meaning people associate with a date and it's the sense in which it feels like a fresh start to them, the bigger the effect we get when we try to use it, which is part of why a conversation with a client feels like it might be a useful way to help identify what are the ones that they really resonate with that are coming up and that might be perfect for them to say like, yeah, that's a meaningful chapter break for me and a time when I'm going to feel ready to make this change.
Okay, that's great. Tiffany, I'm curious, is this a practice that you've put into place before? Have you sort of found yourself implicitly doing this, or is this something maybe now you could start working on?
I don't think it's something that I've intentionally done. I do have thinking of as Katy was talking, I had examples in my head where, yeah, we've done this with clients, right? When we've talked about, okay, what is the action plan we're going to take to get to the next step? And a lot of that had a starting point that was whether it was intentional or not, a fresh start. So I find that fascinating that there's actual science and research behind it.
Tiffany, I'm curious what other sort of actions you have maybe more intentionally put into place to try to get clients to change.
So I know Katy brought up reframing, right? Reframing is a big thing that we do because it needs to resonate with a client. A client's not going to buy in. They're not going to make the change if it's not going to align with their values and what they're trying to accomplish. And reframing it in a way where it's something like estate planning, as an example. Everybody avoids and loves to procrastinate when it comes to estate planning. But if you reframe it in a way that resonates with that client, they're more likely to take the next steps and the action items needed to get there. So that's something that we do quite a bit with clients.
Can you just unpack that a little bit more? When you say reframe it in a way that resonates with them, what do you mean by that exactly?
So I have a client that I'm working through with estate planning right now, and this was something that was getting put off for well over a year. And one of the things that I found was important to them, and they wanted to make sure that they were exploring throughout their life is their family, taking care of their family, making sure their family is in a good place. Their estate plan did not align with that, right? Mm-hmm. Because it was drafted before everyone was included, when their children were children, and now they're grown adults and there's grandchildren that they want to provide for. So I had to reframe it in a way where if something were to happen to you yesterday, your values would not align with what would happen, right? Your legacy goals are not aligned with your estate plan. And that's what got them to take the next step, because it became more personal and less of a task and more of a, this is important for me to actually accomplish. Everything needs to align and I need to feel okay with this.
I love that. I'm also now, I don't know if you can tell, I'm thinking about the things that I haven't done, and I'm like, ooh, yeah, that my inability to take care of X, Y, and Z, I don't need to mention them, is definitely not in line with my values or my stated values. Katy, because procrastination has come up, and Tiffany was just mentioning it, I'm curious, and because there's a whole chapter of your book, but I'm curious what other practical solutions you and the literature recommend to combat procrastination, in conjunction with the sort of reframing. That I've never actually thought about the sort of like idea that Tiffany just brought up in the space of procrastination, but I'm curious your reaction to that and other strategies that you've thought about.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think about procrastination in terms of carrots and sticks, right? So procrastination is this challenge that arises because a lot of our goals are good for us in the long run, but they're not that fun in the short run. And we are present biased, which means we overweight instant gratification and undervalue long-term rewards. So in order to bring those things into better alignment so that we do what's good for us in the long run and don't overweight the present so much, we have to set up sort of strategies that realign things. So one way is by creating carrots. So we make it more enjoyable and more instantly gratifying to do the thing, like get it done, do the estate planning. And the other is sticks, which is we make it more painful to put it off. So one can be we get someone to make a commitment and say, yes, I'm not ready. I'm not prepared to do this estate planning right now. But you say, okay, well, when would be a good time? Sort of, if you can force the issue. And then they say, well, next month on Tuesday the 17th, I'm willing. Yeah, as long as they don't say how about never. If they say how about never, that's tough. But sometimes you can get people to recognize, yeah, I want to do it eventually, just not in this moment. And then you want to put a pin in when is that specific time, schedule it, put it on the calendar, and have some sort of consequence if they don't follow through. Like, well, we're literally going to have a meeting. So you're going to show up to this meeting and we're not going to get anything done. Or in some of the research on commitments of this type, you literally find some kind of penalty. Like, people create penalty clauses for themselves. This is a little odd in financial planning, but one of my favorite examples is a smoking cessation program that worked better when people had a way to put money on the line that they would have to forfeit if they failed a urine test for nicotine or cotinine, proving that they hadn't actually quit smoking. And that actually increased quit rates by 30% over a standard smoking cessation program. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, how do you find a either a carrot or a stick is, I think, a really important part of this. And I think what you described in the values was sort of a carrot. You're creating a carrot by making it more present and important to me, that there actually is something I need to do now that I really value and that I don't want to procrastinate on.
I'm sort of chuckling because I'm thinking about the idea of, an advisor saying like, we're going to have this massive punishment and there's going to be I'm not really sure what urine test you would do for an estate plan per se, but what's interesting about this, what's particularly interesting about this in all seriousness is that there's so much great literature on, the carrot and sticks idea.
Sorry, Hal.
And, yeah,
I'm going to be thinking of the urine test for the estate plan for the rest of the day. I feel like you could make a meme out of that. So I don't know what else I just have to interrupt you and tell you that's very vivid. And
if anyone's curious what I'll be rethinking at 2 a.m. tonight, that is the thing. I think there's so much work on the carrots and the sticks. And yeah, in advising, and you I think sort of hinted at this, Katy, it's like the carrot makes a lot more sense. That stick is subtle. It's like we'll set up a meeting, but do you really want to show up to a meeting not having done the thing? But Tiffany, and maybe it's hard to answer. Have you ever put into place some sort of stick, even if it's subtle, the one that Katy's talking about? How would you do that?
I definitely have given clients homework and due dates with it ending with meeting with me. That's probably the closest that I have that's acceptable in our industry. But
or might also, I could imagine you might do, I don't know if this is true, but that you try to bring another person into that meeting too, so that it's not just that they owe it to you now to show up prepared, but maybe there's another member of their family who they're sort of accountable to show up prepared and ready to make this change. That's another version of a stick I could imagine working in this context of the social punishment, as opposed to, again, let's not do a urine test, but how do we make it so that there would be a cost in terms of my responsibility to others if I fail to follow through by this certain time?
Sorry, Tiffany, were you going to respond to that?
No, that definitely is good, because we do a lot of family meetings when it comes to certain topics, right? Whether it is a business sale or something like that, where decisions have to be made in order for us to really make progress. So when there are going to be other people in the room, whether it's an accountant, family, attorney, it does provide a little bit of pressure to get movement on their end.
This is funny because literally right before we started talking, I got a note from my own financial advisor, because there's 2 items that I've been delinquent on, and he did CC. I'm typically the one who's more in contact with him, and most of the time it's a family email, but this one he made particular sure to CC my wife on it to let her know that I also haven't followed through on this. So that I think is it is subtle, but that is an accountability that I think definitely works there. Let me switch a little bit from procrastination to just general follow through. I know that procrastination is part of that, but I think a lot of times we do get people to commit to something, or even ourselves, right? But then we or our clients don't follow through. This is more for you to start with, Katy. And you had mentioned pre-commitment earlier, and I would love to, if you want to unpack that or anything else, how do you recommend that we ramp up follow through, generally speaking?
Yeah, well, actually, we haven't talked as much about the carrot, but I think that's a useful tool to talk about a little bit for ramping up follow through. One of my favorite findings in our literature in the last decade is from research out of the University of Chicago by Eilert Fishbach, showing that too often we focus on the most efficient and effective way to pursue a goal, and not often enough do we actually think about how can I do this in a way that I'll enjoy so that I'm not dreading it. And actually, what matters a lot in predicting whether we persist on our goals is whether they feel miserable in the moment. If we can find a way to make it more enjoyable, whether that's actually showing up for the meeting with your financial advisor or finding a way for the budgeting work that you have to do in advance to be enjoyable, or finding ways to, say, trim spending that aren't painful but have, maybe you are pursuing your goal in tandem with a friend, so it feels more social to think about what's the plan we're going to create, each of us, to achieve our financial goals, and how are we going to stick to it together. I think we don't spend enough time recognizing that it can't be sort of puritanical to achieve our goals, but instead we have to find a way to, in the Mary Poppins sense, like have a spoonful of sugar be part of the process. And so I could see a lot of ways of thinking about that in terms of financial planning and financial success. It could be that, you, Tiffany, are just like incredibly funny and delightful. And so every meeting is a pleasure. It might be that you take your clients out for tasty meals while you're discussing these things at their favorite restaurant. So they always have that to look forward to. It might be that, there's somebody else you bring to the table who is also supporting in that way. But like, what are the ways that we can make it more enjoyable, and that can really encourage follow through so that there's not a dread associated with getting something done, but actually it's a pleasure.
Tiffany, I'm curious, like, what is your spoonful of sugar?
So there's a few things. So my nightmare is having a client avoid me because my meetings aren't fun. So I try to keep my meetings light and enjoyable.
Cool. Okay.
That's just my goal in life, is just making sure my clients don't avoid me and when they want to pick up the phone when I call, right? Separate from that, and kind of the spoonful of sugar, and I don't necessarily am a part of this, but it's something that I do, quote, prescribe to my clients, is for a lot of couples that aren't necessarily always on the same page with their, quote, budget or how they're spending money and where the money is going, I'll have them take money dates. So you're going to go out for a nice dinner, you're going to open a bottle of wine, and you're going to go through these topics together. And then you're going to tell me how it went, right? We're going to make it into a date night, not into a chore, right? And that's something that a number of my clients do now.
I love that. And that's really close. So I've done research on a concept I call temptation bundling, which is only allowing yourself to enjoy some temptation while simultaneously doing a chore. So the classic example is like, I only get to binge watch my favorite TV show while I'm on the elliptical at the gym. And now I look forward to my workouts because I want to find out what happens to my favorite characters, and time flies. But I love that example of the date night temptation bundle. Like, we have our favorite wine in front of us, we have a great meal, and it's this pleasant experience to talk about our finances instead of something that we dread because we associate it with these great experiences. And maybe there's a special restaurant we save for budget nights. So anyway, I really love that. It's really aligned with the research we've done on how important it is to add that spoonful of sugar, and you can use that temptation bundling term to describe it.
I also really love that because it's funny because you are suggesting to your clients that they spend money, which is which I know is part of it, but you could imagine that an advisor might say, well, let's think about it in a way that we can also not tap into what we've built up, but then the meeting won't happen, or it's going to be unpleasant. And your other idea of making the meetings fun and light is great if that's you, right? I'm sure that there's going to be some advisors listening to this say, like, that's not me. That's not how I do things. But the money date idea and other things like that, and bringing in Katy's temptation bundling, which is easily one of my top 3 favorite social science ideas of the last 15 years, I think covers that, right?
That's very kind. You just made my day.
Okay, well, I was just trying to make sure that actually did encompass when it first came out.
Yes, 15 years covers it.
Something like that. I think like that principle is really good. Sorry, Katy.
Well, I was going to say, I had another thought bubble, and I'm curious if this resonates with you too, Hal. But I was just thinking about the research on how we remember experiences and how it might be relevant here. So there's this really interesting research. I think Danny Kahneman's the person we mostly attribute it to, on what's called the peak end rule, where the sort of peak moment, the most extreme moment of an experience, and the last moment of an experience are the ones we remember it most for. The weird application that is most commonly discussed when talking about the peak end rule was very vivid. So from urine tests to colonoscopies. So there is this really interesting study of colonoscopies that show people have a memory that the colonoscopy experience was like not as bad if at the end, instead of just like ending the colonoscopy at a not so pleasant moment with, I'm obviously not a doctor, but like with a quick extraction, which I guess hurts a lot, you like slow down, and at the end it's like a very slow, and it actually lengthens this unpleasant experience, but the end isn't quite so bad, and then people actually remember it as better and are more likely to come back and have another colonoscopy years later. They've also done this with other stimuli, but that's just the vivid example that we all think of when we think of the peak end effect, because it's such a wacky study. But what we've learned from that is that if we're thinking about how do we curate an experience so that our clients, say, might want to come back and talk to us again and like think of it positively, actually it's really important, even if you do have to have a tough conversation with them, say, to end on a light positive note, like to have it end with, something good, some positive closure. And if you have the ability to curate a sort of peak part of the experience too, like maybe you're giving them a gift of a nice bottle of wine, or you're suggesting that they go on this date. But you can think about like their memory is not going to be an average of all the moments of your meeting. It's going to be focused more on that very last bit, and also like sort of whatever was the most notable moment in the whole meeting. And so you could use that understanding of the way we remember experiences to make sure you're leaving them wanting to come back again.
I think that's a great suggestion. That's a great application too of the original,
It's a
classic research and
I don't think it was
not
in the
expecting
discussion
to go on
section of the paper on colonoscopies. Weirdly, that financial advisors should use this insight, but it's so obvious right now.
Yeah, no, it is so obvious. I love it. All right, well, I want to just do like a rapid fire one here. Let me start with you, Katy. I mean, we've talked about a lot already, but there's obviously so much more. I'm curious if there's anything you want the sort of advisor side, the practice side, to know about this sort of general topic of change management, anything you'd want them to do differently, something that pops up that we didn't talk about. This is sort of free reign for you.
Oh gosh, great question. I would say, I think one of the most important things in all the research on change is that just like there's no one size fits all financial plan that's like, everybody should have, target date funds. Yeah, maybe everybody should have a target date fund, but like generally, that's still personalized because it has a target date. So just as there isn't sort of normally a one size fits all fix for what somebody needs to do to pull their portfolio into order, there's not a one size fits all solution to change. And actually, it's important to understand what are the barriers that a specific person is facing with, we can go back to your initial example, Tiffany, of making the step into retirement. Or, you can think of someone who isn't accumulating savings enough, or someone who hasn't thought about estate planning. What is it that's holding them back? And then the solutions from the science of behavior change actually are quite different depending on what they're struggling with. If they're struggling to just begin, maybe looking for fresh starts can be important. If they're struggling with procrastination, you may need deadlines and, we talked about commitment devices. If they're struggling with even believing that they have the capacity to make this kind of change, there's a whole other set of things that can be useful around building confidence and giving them role models and creating some sort of social reference points that make them believe, wait, I can do this. People like me have achieved this. So I guess that would be the main thing I think it's important to share, is just as you think about personalizing your approach to financial advising regarding like the specific advice you will offer about someone's finances and what they need to do, thinking similarly about how do you tailor the approach you take to helping your client actually make those changes to the barriers holding them back behaviorally.
Fantastic. Heterogeneity matters. I love that. Okay, Tiffany, sort of flipping this to you, is there anything that you would want the academic side, people like Katy and me, to know more about? Maybe, by the way, if you have come up with a great study idea, we'll happily take that too. But anything you're noticing, you're like, I wish there was more literature about this. I wish there was more professors, academics studying this topic. I'd love to hear that from you.
I feel like there's a lot more being done about intergenerational relationships and the effects that has on decision making and, approaches to money and money management individually. What I think would be interesting is to see how much that has changed or evolved over the past 5 years since COVID, because, I'm big on legacy planning and philanthropy, and I've noticed a trend in changes in how people and where people give to over the course of the last 5 years since COVID. So I'm curious to see if that's had an effect in other areas as well.
That's great. I love that as a topic. All right. This is such a fantastic conversation. I could easily continue on with both of you, but let me just stop here and say thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to me. Katy, Tiffany, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.